Good morning once again. The DA will march on the ANC's headquarters at Luthuli House in Johannesburg this morning. The official opposition alleges that the ANC's poor governance is the cause of the country's problems, especially the energy crisis. So has the country entered a new era of politics? And is this, excuse me, a healthy political engagement? Former DA leader Tony Leon joins us via our video link this morning. Tony, thanks very much indeed for coming on. Obviously, the DA's critics will say this is an example of politricking. What's your take? And perhaps a question to you, if you were still the DA leader, is this the way that you would advance the discussion around the energy crisis?
Well, look, I don't think it's just one thing or one tactic. I think there are several tactics, and if I were the leader of the DA, I'd embrace a range of tactics, because this is the greatest economic and social emergency this country's faced in, 30 years perhaps. Leave aside the politics of it, everyone's affected across the board, from small homes to big businesses. And the question is, what are you going to do? Now, I think it's absolutely fair to say there's a strong tradition in South Africa, even recent times, of protests and marches and demonstrations. I'm absolutely convinced that the public demonstrations against Jacob Zuma did not lead to Zuma's fall, as they called for, but I'm equally convinced that it was part of building a narrative that Jacob Zuma was a president who was harming the interests of South Africa, which ultimately prevailed when the ANC felt threatened electorally by his continuance. And I suspect, but don't know, that the DA calculation is something like that, that we've got to shine the light on where the problem is. And the problem isn't actually at Megawatt Park. The problem, as Megawatt Park indicated in Parliament yesterday, goes right back to 1998, when the ANC government rejected the Energy White Papers. So we didn't build new capacity, we didn't embrace renewables, we didn't maintain our plant or maintain our staff. So, it was all there, and it was all rejected by the government. So I guess marching on the governing party does make some kind of sense, provided you do other things as well. And to the extent there's a connection, and there is obviously, between the DA as a party and the city of Cape Town, which it governs, the announcement yesterday that the city of Cape Town is going to now be buying private electricity, feeding it back into the grid from homeowners and businesses, is a practical solution to what has become a critical problem.
Perhaps not so much a coincidence, or shall we say it's an interesting coincidence, that the ANC's cadre deployment policy is also this week in the High Court being challenged. What's the connection there to the energy crisis, would you say?
I would say it's absolutely profound. We know it's profound because Eskom's gone through 10 CEOs in 10 years, and a lot of appointments were made for entirely ideological and political reasons, and a lot of seasoned staff were removed, also to make way for others who had political connectivity or met some kind of demographic requirement. So I think cadre deployment, the idea that people are put into positions because of political or ideological reasons, has interfered with what has really should be an engineering solution to the country's energy needs. And I don't know what the outcome of that court case is going to be, obviously, but I do know that that policy has been destructive in both its implementation and even its design. And we see that in our electricity crisis. And I think why the focus is on the ANC as a party is this is entirely within the lifespan of this ANC government. I mentioned 1998, that's when the crisis started, and it's just mushroomed since then. It's not something that you can say, well, the previous regime should have, or Van Riebeeck might have. That's not relevant. This has happened within the lifespan of this government. The decisions it made, the deadlines it missed, the procurements it hasn't done, and those that it has done, and the people it's appointed. And we now are in a perfect storm, and I think it's absolutely correct that political opponents of the ANC point out where the root of the problem is.
It's true as well, Tony, that as much as the country is sort of at a crossroads, and it has been for some time insofar as the energy crisis is concerned. As you said at the start of our discussion, this is the biggest threat to our democracy, to our economy, to the livelihoods of South Africa, and we're talking about load shedding. It's also true that the ANC is at a turning point insofar as next year's elections are concerned. This will no doubt play a massive role in how the ANC fares when our country goes to the polls next year. And it's also true, it will have an impact on how the DA fares.
Yeah, I think the political impact of the electricity crisis is, as you correctly say, Michelle, across the board. I mean, and I guess that's one of the reasons, just in terms of today's performative aspect with this march, is why the DA wants to sort of remain relevant in the mix. Because it's one thing for the government and the ANC as the governing party to shoulder the blame. The question is, how do you insert yourself into the debate? So I suppose that's one of the strategies that are being considered. But yeah, I think it's going to play out very, very severely because people understand. I mean, it's not, we can argue there are some things that happen because we don't really notice they're happening. When you don't have electricity for 6-8 hours a day, this is a problem, and that you had it before, and now you don't have very much of it, and there's enough information going around to know where to locate the source of the problem, which I guess is the address of today's march. So I think its effect on the government is going to be profound. Incidentally, it's not just the DA who's directing attention at a certain address. The ANC, starting from the president downward, are relocating the problem. So, for instance, they're attacking NERSA with the 18% increase. But as Eskom's response said, well, these what we're doing is not cost-free. The cost has got to be borne. So there's been an intention to sort of divert it into Eskom's problem or NERSA's problem. But actually, the problems straddle both of them and go beyond just two institutions. It goes to the heart of government today.
Yeah, you talk about relocating the problem. That's a very sort of diplomatic way of saying that the ANC is shifting the blame, right? And you've been talking about Cyril Ramaphosa and his address at the Free State elective conference over the weekend, where he says he's asked NERSA to halt on that 18.65% increase, which of course is not the president's prerogative, nor is it the ANC president's prerogative, or even NERSA's prerogative, Tony.
Absolutely, it isn't, and that's why you have these independent regulators making these determination applications. But I have to say, talking about NERSA and talking about the problem we face, there's a most extraordinary expose, which seems to get very little attention here, done by the Financial Times Joburg correspondent, Joseph Cottrell, that when an application was made for gas, and bear in mind that Gwedi Mantashe is a fossil fuel champion, likes gas, doesn't like renewables. It sat on Mantashe's desk for 6 months. This was an application by Eskom before he added amendments to it, sent to NERSA. NERSA took another 6 months to turn it down. And you've got to say, in the middle of an emergency, why was there no sense of urgency in the Minister of Energy's office? It took 6 months to process something, then to amend it to such an extent it became unimplementable by the regulating authority, which took another 6 months to turn it down. This is 12 months, which would have added about 3,000 megawatts onto the grid fairly rapidly, as I understand it. And, it's this kind of lethargy, sloth, beyond the ideology, beyond the corruption, beyond the incompetence that's well known, that just makes you shake your head and say, catch a wake up, please. Absolutely.
You called it performative. We all know the importance of protest action in our country over many, many decades. So today's protest by the Democratic Alliance, however you see it, what South Africans really want is solutions to our load-shedding crisis. Tony Leon, former DA leader, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. It's coming up for 5 to 6.